May the Lord be with you. This is Pastor Ryan over here at St. Peter's in beautiful upstate Minnesota. And I'm just recording a quick video because this weekend, on the 16th of May, the church will be commemorating and celebrating the life, witness, and ministry of St. Brendan the Navigator. Got one of my favorite pictures of him right here. Now, Brendan the Navigator lived in 6th century Ireland. As a young boy, he was well educated in the church. He grew up to become a monk and was ordained a priest at 26. He then went around founding a bunch of monasteries, and he was famous as a traveler. He went to Wales and Brittany and Scotland and the coast of France. Back in those days, there were Irish Christians called peregrines. And these were the pilgrims, the far travelers, who would take their great learning, because Ireland has always been a center of Christian education, and they would spread it throughout Europe. In those days, much of Europe was baptized, much of Europe was formally within the fold of the church, but most of them didn't really know what that meant, what all that entailed. As one historian notably put it regarding the Germanic and Nordic tribes, they were very dedicated to Jesus Christ. Not big on the Ten Commandments, but very dedicated to Jesus Christ. And so that's why the Irish went out to teach them what the new faith actually meant. There is a lovely book that is in large part on this subject called How the Irish Saved Civilization by Thomas Cahill. Came out in the 90s, I think. It's still a pretty rousing read, though not necessarily for kids. The Middle Ages were not for the faint of heart. Now, Brendan the Navigator is known as one of the 12 Apostles of Ireland. He was supposed to be taught by some great saints. He was supposed to have met Columcille up in Scotland. And, of course, he was supposed to have companions who went on to be famous saints in their own right. But the thing that he is most famous for in history and in legend is his journey to find the Isle of the Blessed, the paradise of the saints. Basically, there was a fellow who washed up on the shores near one of Brendan's monasteries once upon a time and told him that he had glimpsed, on a long voyage, he had glimpsed what he believed to be the Garden of Eden, the earthly paradise spoken of in Genesis. And Brendan thought, well, heck, if this guy saw it, I got to get out there and find it. So he gathered a crew of a bit over a dozen other monks, and in some versions of the story, there were some unbelievers who hopped on to join him at the very end, and they set off on what became a 7-year journey looking for the Garden of Eden, looking for the earthly paradise. And this is recorded in a book, the Voyage of St. Brendan, and it's a wonderful sort of medieval romance. Because as they go, of course, they visit all these various islands, some of which are paradises in their own right, and some of which are enchanted. They run into magic and wonder and great saints. And so some highlights. At one point, Brendan said that they saw the boiling pits of hell with fire and lava tossing themselves up in the air, and devils throwing rocks at ships that passed nearby. They said that they saw great towers and cathedrals of crystal sitting on the sea. At one point, it is said that they went to an island where Brendan encountered Judas. And they said that on every Sunday and every feast day, Judas was allowed to come out of hell and rest on this island. And in fact, in the story, in the evening, demons came to torment Judas, and Brendan fought them off to give Judas an evening of rest, a respite from torment. And I love that story because it reflects compassion and, I think, hope, even for the damned. It never says in the Bible or anywhere in church history that Judas was damned. It never says he wasn't forgiven. I realize this is a side note, but there's a beautiful tale by Madeleine L'Engle where it says that, Judas betrays Christ, as in the Gospels. He repents, he feels sorry, he throws back the silver, he hangs himself in his grief, and he wakes up in a deep pit that he can't climb out of. The sides are too slick, and he realizes what he's done, and he weeps and he weeps, and he doesn't know how long he cries for, but eventually his tears fill up the hole that he's in, and he manages to float and swim and crawl out of the hole. And he sees there Jesus and the apostles at the Last Supper, where Judas, got up and went out in the middle of the night to betray Christ. And Jesus says to Judas in this story, in this afterlife, we couldn't finish without you. And that kind of compassion, that kind of scandalous mercy is shot throughout the tales of Brendan the Navigator. Yes, there is hell, there is sin, there are devils in his stories, but ultimately they don't win. The mercy of Christ overcomes even perdition, even the torments of hell. Another great story of Brendan the Navigator is that it is said that he was on the sea one Easter Sunday, and they were like, this is terrible. We can't celebrate Mass for the resurrection of our Lord. And they found this skerry. Well, a skerry is like a very small island, almost like a rock in the sea. And they're like, all right, let's get out, let's celebrate Mass. And they started to have the Divine Liturgy, to have communion. And when they were done, the skerry moved because it was a sea monster or a whale. So you will often see the image of St. Brendan having communion on the back of a whale, a leviathan. Wonderful story. Anyway, he eventually gets back, has other adventures, becomes legendary in his own right. And the stories of Brendan the Navigator clearly aren't meant to be taken literally. Rather, they exemplify how human life is a questing, a searching for God. And that even on the journey, God is always with us. God is always providing. We are never left orphaned. We are never abandoned. Even as we move toward God, God is with us always on our way. And this is what Christian life should be. It should be questing. It should be adventure. It should be bravery. It should be always on the lookout for wonders. It should be celebrating the resurrection of Christ on the back of a sea monster. I mean, you can't have a higher adventure than that. And of course, at the end of the story, he does succeed. He finds the earthly paradise. Now, centuries later, people started reading the stories of St. Brendan and saying, wait a minute, this sounds familiar. The islands he's describing, these sound like actual places that we know. And the hell that he describes with the rocks and the lava and whatnot, that sounds kind of like Iceland, which is indeed a volcanic island. And those towers of crystal, that sounds rather like icebergs, which are out there in the North Atlantic. And even when he's getting to the paradise of the saints, he's describing places that some say sound like North America. Is it possible that a 6th century Irish Christian monk reached North America, 500 years before Leif Erikson and darn near 1,000 years before Christopher Columbus? People, of course, doubted this because the Irish at the time would have been using skin boats, which is literally boats made out of leather. And leather doesn't do so well on the open ocean. Worms being a wonderful reason why they would spring leaks pretty quickly. But in the 1980s, I think it was the 80s, there were fellas in Ireland who were like, we got to try this out. And so they built a replica 6th century skin boat and made it from Ireland all the way over to North America in a ship made of leather. It was called the Brendan Journey. There's books about it. I think there was a documentary. Anyway, one adventure begets another in the Christian faith. And with Christ at our side, there's no limit to what we can discover. For indeed, God is infinite. And the better we know him, the closer we grow to him, the more we realize there is so much more to God than we could ever have imagined, that we could ever have given him credit for. So this weekend, maybe read a copy of Brendan's Voyages if you can get your hands on them. I think they're free on Kindle. But more importantly, remember that Christ is always with us, that every danger can be an adventure, and that life in Jesus, life in the church, should be one of high adventure and bravery and daring and fearless exploration and new discoveries every day until the day when we die and rise to what will surely be the greatest adventure, the greatest discovery of them all. Anyway, just a thought. Go in peace. Serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.